This curious soul has finally finished her grow medium experiment, and in this video I finally go over the last grow medium that I wanted to try out, and that is CocoCoir. Let's see how it went. What's going on, my plant peoples? I am the ADHD gardener, where I use gardening, houseplants, and humor as a form of mental health therapy. And I gotta say, I like CocoCoir. That is some really good stuff. Now, over the winter time, I've been experimenting with different grow mediums because, you know what, as I'm trying to level up my gardening, I want to learn more and more about different things about plants. Now, I know that there are a variety of different grow mediums when it comes to seed starting, and most seed starting mixes generally call for peat moss. And I understand that peat moss is some wonderful thing. However, I am not a fan of peat moss. But I also knew that there were other options, or moss options, I guess if you want to say, that are available. So you're not really limited to just peat moss. So let me clarify a few things with the part one that I forgot to mention in that one. As much as I love the sphagnum moss, I did not find that to be really good. I mean, it did germinate, and it really did, and it is an option. So let's say you don't have peat moss or you don't have CocoCoir, you can use the sphagnum moss. As much as I love the sphagnum moss, I want to be able to just keep that just for the house plants and the plants that really want that sphagnum moss. It was a viable option to grow the seeds because I did prove it. Another problematic thing that I found with sphagnum moss was how it was arrived, or how it came in a bag. It wasn't shredded up like typical peat moss. So it was really hard to kind of get the sphagnum moss to be broken down. So if you think about it, it's not really going to be very viable for a large veggie seed starting mission. I'm going to save the sphagnum moss for my house plants. Now that leaves us with peat moss. And we all know that all seed starting mixes use peat moss as a seed starting mix. It really holds on to some moisture. It really allows for some good germination. Problem is, I can't stand peat moss. Yo, my problems with peat moss, bro. I can't stand the way it's so powdery. It's so powdery. And then when it's in that really, really dry state, it is extremely hard to get it saturated with water. It's just awful, and I can't stand it. The thing is, I cannot avoid using peat moss because especially when I'm going outdoors in the springtime, I'm gonna be using different methods and techniques that involve peat moss. So I'm hoping that this experiment is going to work through, because if I can find a good bulk amount of CocoCoir, wow, I want to seriously experiment with a large scale amounts of CocoCoir. But sometimes when you're listening to other gardeners talk about maybe another alternative to peat moss, they can be mentioning CocoCoir. Now, CocoCoir is actually the husk of the coconut. It is a really good source of moisture retention, and also freely drains and dries up pretty good. It basically acts just like a peat moss. Now, when you order your CocoCoir, it's actually gonna come compressed. All the air is gonna come out of it, and it actually looks like this big block. It's very, very hard. You have to just basically kind of resaturate it all over again. But when it does, the CocoCoir actually grows or doubles and triples in size. And that's the beauty about CocoCoir, which I did not see that in peat moss, which was peat moss is just peat moss. Let me know down in the comments below if peat moss actually comes in compressed blocks. Do they even do that? Damn it, now I gotta Google that. Amazon, which is where I bought this one actually, it was actually pretty cheap. It was like 15 bucks or something. Don't get me, I don't know about the actual number. I'll put it up right on here. Now, I bought this CocoCoir actually off of Amazon. I'll drop a link down in the description if you wanna go check it out. But it came in a one big, heavy compressed block. Now, I gotta say, this right off the bat was a lot easier to resaturate than peat moss. Wow, if you've ever resaturated peat moss, it's messy. Peat moss is just so messy, bro. Messy. It's powdery, it's fluffy, it's really airy. Oh my gosh, and it gets everywhere, and I personally can't stand it. Another reason with peat moss also is, man, when it dries up, it dries up. That sucker gets rock hard, and it gets hydrophobic, which means it does not like water at all. So it takes a long time for you to rehydrate that peat moss. Now, CocoCoir, I mean, granted, it is going to take some time to rehydrate it, but nothing like the peat moss. There's minimal dust off of the CocoCoir. I really enjoyed it. Also, the CocoCoir wasn't as fluffy and airy just like the peat moss was, because we all know peat moss, when you're trying to resaturate it, wow, messy, airy, fluffy. Now that's actually kind of what we want, but the resaturation phase sucks. So I really wanted to find an alternative option. I give the first win of rehydration to the Coco Coir because wow, rehydration is a lot easier and a lot less messier than peat moss. Now when it comes to the seeds, how did it grow some seedlings? Let's find out. And I gotta say, what? I loved it. I loved growing seeds out of Coco Coir. I mean, it really did work out. Not only was it a lot easier to rehydrate, and it was just, I don't know, I can't even describe it. It's just so much less messier. I mean, it's still gonna be messy, people. I know, you can't avoid mess, but I guess maybe I just can't stand peat moss that much. I can't stand peat moss. Now this whole entire tray has my Coco Coir and vermiculite. Now, if you've seen the part 1 experiment, I did experiment with vermiculite by itself. So we learned a lot about it. Yes, you can germinate seeds using vermiculite just by itself, but normally vermiculite is actually just mixed in with other seed starting mixes. So what I have here is actually a Coco Coir vermiculite mix. How much vermiculite to use when I'm doing my seed starting mix. And I have this really big bowl here that I was using as a, my scale, I guess, if you want to call it. Now, I was experimenting with the different ratios, and I did find that the entire bowl with just a little center seemed to work out the best. And that must have been at least for a 5-to-1 ratio. I like the 5-to-1 ratio, I think, but the 4-to-2 one I've also used before, and that actually worked out pretty good. Now, I actually heard from other gardeners that you can put vermiculite on top of your seed starting mix and as well as your potting mix too, if you want to avoid having those fungus gnats breeding inside of your soil. The vermiculite offers a layering, so those fungus gnats cannot reach down to the soil. Now you have to put a good amount of vermiculite on top of it. This is the non-coarse, this is the really fine vermiculite. I am not a fan of the fine vermiculite. I just do not like that. This one was very hard to handle in its dry state. It was super powdery. Oh, I couldn't stand it. Now this vermiculite is more coarse. You can see the larger pieces right over in here. This is actually horticultural grade vermiculite. So I'm going to be using this one from now on. This is my go-to vermiculite size. I'll drop a link down in the description below so you can go check that out if you want to. I love this horticultural vermiculite. That's some really good stuff. Now whatever seed starting mix you're using is actually all of it is going to be peat moss or Coco Coir based. That means that it's going to dry up very fast. If you have it under grow lights like this, it tends to dry out. So that means you're going to be watering your trays and your seedlings very frequently. But when in the beginning with the germination phase, this being that the light is right there, this dries out really fast, which is another reason why I put the vermiculite on top. It kind of separates the really intense light from there and from drying it out. I mean, it is going to dry, but it's not going to dry out as fast with the vermiculite on top. Make sure that you're keeping your seed trays well saturated. As the seeds are starting off in the beginning, in order for them to germinate, they're going to need a good amount of water to break down, break through that little seed. Some seeds are small that require less. Some seeds are a lot larger. These loofahs were a lot larger seeds than, let's say, the green onions. So this one is going to need a lot more water. You want to keep this Coco Coir or your seed starting mix well saturated. So I'm just going to be going throughout the day, multiple times a day really, and just kind of sprinkling some water on. Not a heavy gush of water. This is actually my sprinkler water bottle. I did a video on that too. I'll drop it up here down below. And I will be using Coco Coir as my standard for seed starting mix. Man, I really love that the best. Now, will I give up my peat moss? No. Will I get rid of peat moss? No, I can't get rid of it. All gardeners, if not most of them, will come across peat moss at some part of their life. I gotta say, Coco Coir for the win. It will definitely 1000% replace my peat moss. I can't stand peat moss. As much as I hate peat moss, I have to keep it around, and I actually am going to be using it in another different gardening technique I'm going to be trying this spring, the square foot gardening method, and that one calls for peat moss. It does have its perks. It really does. However, when it comes to seed starting, Coco Coir for the win. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it wasn't one of the most exciting videos. However, I hope it was informative. And if you did enjoy this video and you want to show me some love, then don't forget to smash that like button. I really appreciate it. Also, if you haven't already, then consider subscribing. I drop a video every week and then some in between. Don't forget about the notification bell, because without that, you won't know I dropped a video. And last but not least, you can catch me on Facebook and Instagram. I'm on there all the time. You can drop me a message. I post a lot of funny memes, DIY projects, and a little bit on the personal side, because a gal's got to vent every now and again. And as usual, we both are going to be growing our happiness one plant at a time, one day at a time. And until the next episode, you guys, peace and love.